that he was much safer in the air with me than, for example, in a railway train, where it was much more difficult to take effective precautionary measures, which had, in any case, to be on a much wider scale. For example, if he wanted to go by special train from, say, Berlin to Munich, hundreds of people had to know about the train's movements in advance, so that an attack, perhaps by placing explosives on the line to cause a derailment, was much easier than dealing with a plane, which it was quite simple to guard. The result was that Hitler much preferred to appear suddenly and unannounced, and this he regarded as the best protection for his person. I used to go to the airfield to get my plane in order and make a trial takeoff about half an hour before we actually left, but as I often flew other important people, ministers and so on, my presence at an airfield was no definite indication that Hitler was about to follow. As I had to study the weather charts before each flight, this might have given away our destination, but to prevent it, I always asked for the lot, and no one knew in which ones I was really interested. After a long battle with the Air Minister, I also obtained permission to keep the old number of my plane, D2600, although by this time the international numbering codes had been introduced. This meant that wherever we went, my plane was known as Hitler's, and we were therefore given every possible facility. We were always served first when we asked for a weather forecast or a wireless bearing, and if other planes happened to be in the air ahead of us when we had to be talked down in bad visibility, then they had to cruise around whilst we were taken first, which could easily save us 3/4 of an hour and greatly enhanced our safety. In September 1933, I completed my millionth kilometre in the air, about 620,000 miles. And once again I was loaded with honours. But the one which pleased me most was a signed photograph of the famous First World War ace Immelmann, which my mother sent to me telling me to keep it in my plane, which, although it was D2600 to everyone else, was Immelmann to me. Thereafter it was fixed in a silver frame in front of Hitler's seat. Not all my flights with Hitler went smoothly. On one occasion he wanted to fly to Elbing. I happened to know that if the airfield there happened to be soggy, as it often was, it would be very difficult to land and still more difficult to take off. So I first made inquiries and received the information that a plane had flown from Königsberg to Elbing, specially to examine ground conditions, and had reported that everything was in order. I then made arrangements for lighting in the event of a landing after dark, and with that I thought I had done everything I could to ensure a good landing and a good takeoff. And so I had. But the best laid plans of mice and men. We set off for Elbing on 5th November, a damp and humid time of the year, and as soon as I touched down I could feel my wheels beginning to sink into the boggy airfield so that the machine was stopped long before it had rolled out. Despite my 3 engines, it was impossible to get it any further, and Hitler had to get out and tramp through the bog. After that, 150 men with ropes had to be mobilized to drag my machine out of the mud. They succeeded, but a normal start on that quagmire was out of the question. The only thing I could do was to have lines of wooden bowls laid and to lighten the machine as far as possible by jettisoning everything, including the petrol in its tanks, except just enough to get me to Danzig, to which Hitler could go afterwards by car when his business in Elbing was completed. From there I could fly him back to Berlin. Starting on wooden bowls is a tricky business. Only too often one of them will upend and damage the propellers, but I had had enough bad luck for one day, and now my luck was in again, and I got off safely. There was no one else on board, and I had just enough petrol to get me to Danzig. In Danzig I tanked up again, and when Hitler arrived I was able to get him to Berlin without further difficulties. The day after that we flew from Berlin to Marienburg to visit the old Reichspresident, Marshal von Hindenburg, who lived on the Neudeck estate near there. From Marienburg, Hitler wanted to fly on to Kiel for a meeting, but the weather forecasts were so unfavourable that we had to start earlier than intended because I feared that otherwise headwinds would seriously delay us and cause Hitler to be late. We took off at 11:45 hours, and shortly after passing Danzig, we had to fly blind over the Polish corridor against a 60-mile-an-hour headwind. From Rügenwald I flew low, not more than a couple of 100 feet above the sea, following the coastline, and in this way we got safely to Swinemünde. From there I had to fly blind to Kiel using wireless bearings. There was no shortage of them, and at first they seemed to be all right. Further bearings provided near Warnemünde and again near Oldenburg confirmed that I was dead in line for Kiel, so now I went down from about 3,000 to 1,000 feet above the sea in order to do the rest of the journey by direct visibility. But about a quarter of an hour later I was given a bearing which indicated a position about 8 miles south of Lübeck, which would have meant that I had flown due south. But I hadn't changed course, so the bearing was obviously wrong. I instructed my wireless operator to ask for another bearing, and this one gave 12 miles to the northeast of Hamburg. In the end, the confusion was so great that I got fed up and decided to find my own way to Kiel. I went down to about 600 feet and got a sight of the ground again, but to get a horizon sighting I had to go down to about 160 feet. As far as I could see now, there was water everywhere, so I changed course again, to the southwest this time in the hope of sighting land, which we had been able to see a quarter of an hour before. After about 10 minutes, there was still nothing but water, so I changed course due south. Hitler now came forward and wanted to know where we were, and I explained to him that the wireless bearings had confused us so much that I couldn't say, but I thought we couldn't be far from Kiel. As we had been flying for over 4 hours, however, Hitler half feared we must have flown beyond our destination and now be over the North Sea. But then we did come in sight of land, a broad bay with a large town in the background. I couldn't tell Hitler which town it was, so I adopted the old airman's trick in such circumstances. I flew along the railway line to the nearest station and tried to read the name off the board. But when we arrived, a train unsighted us, and as it was letting off great clouds of steam, we were none the wiser. Hitler was looking out from the front of the plane with me now, and suddenly he said, "I know that place. I've spoken there. Look, in that hall, it's Wismar." And he was right, though the bearings which were still coming in said anything but. But I wasn't taking any notice of them now. I had my own bearings, and I decided to fly by sight. We kept within 100 and 150 feet from the ground, and in this way we reached the River Trave. The weather reports from Kiel were very bad, and I flew up and down the Trave trying to identify Travemünde Airport, which I knew quite well, in order to land there, but without success. I had very little petrol left now, enough perhaps for a quarter of an hour, so I warned Hitler that we might have to make an emergency landing in the best place we could find. With my landing flaps down and with my engines throttled back to save petrol, I made a last attempt, flying northwards at about 60 feet over the sea. I came to the bay, but I still couldn't find the airfield, so I told Hitler to go back to his seat and strap himself in, because in landing on soft ground, as this would certainly be after so much rain, the braking effect is often so strong that a plane just turns upside down. I turned landwards and found a stretch of grass which looked fairly suitable for a landing. But just as I was circling to come down, I spotted something to my right, so switching on my engines again, I flew towards it. It was the tower of Travemünde Airfield. From Travemünde, Hitler went by car to Kiel, returning the following morning for me to fly him to Hamburg. As soon as I had time in Hamburg, I went to the wireless station to examine the recorded bearings and find out, if possible, what had gone wrong. It turned out that Kiel, Copenhagen, Stettin, Berlin, Leipzig and Hanover had all been involved in the confusion. Out of 10 bearings taken, 7 had been wrong. Weather phenomena connected with the dusk had deflected the beams. Since then, greatly improved methods have made such distortions impossible. I had already heard a good deal of Eva Braun before I met her. For many people, her relationship to Hitler was a surprise, and to some a disappointment, but for me it represented perhaps the most human thing I knew about Hitler. Eva Braun played no role whatever in the politics of the Third Reich, and she obviously had no desire to do so. Her only interest was in Hitler the man. I found her a simple and charming woman, and I liked and respected her. I had been interested in photography for a long time, and I always took my Leica about with me. One day I showed my snaps, of Hitler and so on, to Hoffmann, the official photographer, and he offered to buy the publication rights of some of them. I told him I didn't need money, but if in future he cared to develop and print my films, enlarging them where necessary, he could have any of them he fancied, and this he agreed to do. In consequence, I was often in Hoffman's studio. One day I went there with my wife, to be greeted by a very good-looking young woman I had not seen before. She didn't know me either, of course, and she asked me my business, but as soon as I mentioned my name, she smiled and said she had heard a lot about me and was very glad to meet me. Then she went to fetch the pictures I had come for. When we left the studio, my wife remarked how attractive she was, saying that she had seldom seen such a pretty girl. Shortly before Christmas 1933, my wife came with my daughter Inga, who was 9 years old at the time, to meet me at the airfield. Hitler shook hands with them both, and then he said to me, "Bauer, women send me far more boxes of chocolates than I can possibly cope with. Some of them are a couple of feet across. Bring your daughter round to see me and I'll see what I can find for her." It was in the afternoon on Christmas Eve that I actually took my daughter to Hitler's Munich flat. His housekeeper, Frau Winter, opened the door to my ring, but told me as I went into the hall that Hitler had a visitor. "Still," she said, "I don't think he'll mind. After all, you aren't a stranger." She knocked on the door, and Hitler's voice called out, "Come in." She opened the door and I went in, to find that his visitor was the very pretty girl we had seen at Hoffman's studio. She flushed, and Hitler looked a little embarrassed. He was about to introduce me, but the girl said at once that it wasn't necessary as we had already met. Hitler now turned his attention to my daughter, talked to her for a while, and then gave her the promised box of chocolates. After that, there were mutual Christmas good wishes, and we left. After the holidays, I flew Hitler back to Berlin, and before I went into lunch, I happened to meet Sepp Dietrich, the captain of Hitler's bodyguard, and I told him about my meetings with Eva Braun. "What do you think of her?" he demanded, and when I said I had been favourably impressed, he went on, "Yes, he's not got bad taste, has he?" I now knew that there was, after all, a woman who had a share in Hitler's life, probably the only woman of whom he was ever really fond. Officially, of course, no one knew anything about the matter, but you can't keep such things secret, and there were soon rumours abroad, truth and falsehood mixed. And in 1935 my wife told me that people were talking about a girl called Eva Braun with whom Hitler was said to be having an affair. Did I know anything about it? Such questions were becoming more and more common. The circles around Hitler which might have been expected to know, and in fact did know, either gave a point-blank denial or pretended not to know anything. Naturally, as I was so often with Hitler, I came into Eva Braun's company a good deal. She was often in my plane, with others flying from Munich to Berlin and back, for example, always, of course, with Hitler's direct permission. In the upshot, I got to know her very well, and I liked her more than ever. More than once she begged me earnestly never to take any unnecessary risks whilst Hitler was on board, which I always promised, though, of course, I would not in any case have taken risks. She had a film camera which she used a good deal at Obersalzberg, and of course her peculiar position meant that she had to be very careful, with the result that she was very often alone and left to her own resources. When there were official visits to the Berghof, she always kept out of sight, and only when Hitler was with a circle of intimates was she present. After the end of each meal, he would rise, kiss her hand, and take her into the adjoining drawing room for coffee. Incidentally, Hitler was always a very attentive host to all the women who ever sat at the same table with him. I was soon friendly enough with Eva to talk to her of her relationship with Hitler. She was well aware that in the ordinary way she could never hope to be his wife, and that she would have to be content to be his lover, and she certainly did love him. I am sure that occasionally she was depressed at the fact that she could never be publicly acknowledged, but she rarely showed any such feelings, and whenever Hitler came back to her again, she was always cheerful and happy. In the end, of course, Hitler did marry her, and although she knew that her marriage would last for a few days only, I believe it gave her deep satisfaction. At least, when her relationship to him was at last officially made known to the world, it was as his wife. Eva Braun's role has been misunderstood and exaggerated. She was a woman brought to the side of a powerful man by love and not ambition, and when the time came and he was no longer powerful, she freely chose to die at his side. In February 1934, Hitler informed me that I should once again be flying him to Italy for a meeting with Mussolini. Actually, it was 26th of March before we set off. It was an official visit to Venice, and a whole retinue of diplomats and officials was to accompany us. So, in all, 3 Ju-52s were in the flight. Once again we landed absolutely punctually, and once again the greetings of the two statesmen were very warm and friendly. In fact, in the meantime, they had really become friends. A military band played the German and Italian national anthems, whilst Hitler, Mussolini and their retinues went along the files inspecting the Guard of Honour. Subsequently, Hitler's hotel was practically besieged by an army of reporters and press photographers. The following morning, the German ambassador, von Hassel, arranged a trip round Venice in a motorboat to show Hitler all the famous sights. But Hitler was primarily interested in the Italian naval units, most of them small, which were drawn up with their crews lined up on deck for his inspection. In the afternoon, a vast assembly of about 70,000 people gathered on the famous St. Mark's Square, where Mussolini delivered one of his usual dramatic speeches from a window of the palace, whilst Hitler and his staff observed the scene from another window. Mussolini was obviously referring to Italy's treaty of alliance with Germany, and from time to time he mentioned Hitler. Then suddenly the crowd realized that Hitler was standing at the other window, and immediately a tremendous roar went up. "Hitler! Duce! Hitler! Duce!" And in their excitement the crowds flung thousands of hats up into the air, hardly one of which could ever have been recovered by its rightful owner. But they didn't seem to mind that or anything else except Mussolini. I don't think I ever saw crowds so hypnotized by anyone, not even Hitler. When he had finished his speech, Mussolini invited Hitler to come to his window so that the two statesmen could stand there together in full view of the crowd. And when Hitler accepted the invitation, the enthusiasm knew no bounds. For at least half an hour, the masses cheered, shrieked, and flung things into the air. Any old hats, no doubt, this time. Hitler was greatly impressed by this tumultuous welcome. That evening, the two statesmen attended a concert in the Palace of the Doges, where the leading talent of Italy sang for them, and where singing is concerned, that is no small thing. In addition to the brilliant assembly actually in the hall, there were many thousands of listeners outside. At the end of the performance, there was again tremendous enthusiasm from the crowds and insistent demands that the two leaders should show themselves, which they did. Hitler, who was a great lover of music, and in particular of operatic music, declared on his return to Berlin that the concert given in his honour in Venice had been truly superb. The following morning there was a march past of all the Italian fascist organisations in the great square, including the youth organisation Balilla. Hitler and Mussolini stood together on a specially constructed platform and took the salute. The Italians marched quickly, and what with the playing of music which seemed designed to make them march faster than ever, the march past became a trot past, and then almost a helter-skelter race past. In the afternoon, Mussolini and his staff saw us off at the airfield and we flew back to Munich. On the way, Hitler stayed with me up in front, once again looking at the magnificent scenery. But this time he was not silent. Instead, he asked me what I had thought of this and that. I could honestly reply that I had been very much impressed by the enthusiastic gathering in St. Mark's Square and by the concert in the Doge's Palace. But as for the military march past of the fascist organisations, frankly I thought that had been very poor. Hitler laughed. "I think that about hits the nail on the head," he said. Soon after our visit to Italy, Hitler told me to prepare for an extended trip to the west. Once again, 3 machines started, first of all to Essen. Later, we were to go on to Bonn. Dr. Goebbels was with us this time. On the way, I was not pleased with the way my port engine was behaving, so when we arrived in Essen, I asked Hitler for permission to fly back to Berlin, have a new engine put in during the night, and be in Essen again the following morning. but Hitler declared that he needed me urgently. "Let someone else fly it back to Berlin," he said. "I want you to fly me, so take one of the other machines." The first thing Hitler did in Essen was to visit Krupp, which he invariably did, to discuss this or that improvement in Germany's armaments. This took several hours, and we took off for Bonn late in the afternoon. From there, Hitler went on by car to Godesberg, where he stayed in the Hotel Dresden as usual. I had already noticed that Dr. Goebbels was not himself. Usually he was witty and cheerful and kept the party, including Hitler, highly amused, but now he was silent, almost morose. Hitler himself didn't seem to be too cheerful either, and I began to wonder what was the matter. Dinner was served at 20 hours in Hitler's special dining room, and a number of high party officials were present. Once again, Hitler was not very talkative, with the result that no one else was either, and the meal proceeded almost in silence. At about 20:15 hours, Dr. Goebbels was called to the phone, and when he returned, he informed Hitler that Sepp Dietrich had arrived in Augsburg with several companies of the bodyguard. "Good," said Hitler, but there was no other comment. I was wondering why it was particularly good that Sepp Dietrich should have arrived in Augsburg with his men, but I couldn't guess. When the meal was over, we all sat around in the adjoining room or on the balcony, and the general depression was still very obvious. At about 21 hours, a Labour Service man arrived and declared that the band of the Labour Service and the choir of the League of German Girls wanted to sing in Hitler's honour. It was quite clear that Hitler was in no mood for it, but he agreed. At about 9:30, we were all on the balcony. A crowd had gathered down below with the band of the Labour Service and the choir of the girls, many of whom were carrying lighted torches. The concert began, and the singing was very good. But before long I noticed to my astonishment that Hitler was in tears. I knew that he was more easily moved than most men, but I couldn't imagine why he should want to cry now. When the concert was over, I decided to get away from the depressing atmosphere and go and find something more amusing to do. But when I went up to Hitler to ask his permission to leave, he refused. "I'm afraid I can't let you go, Bauer. I may need you tonight." It looked as though Hitler might decide to fly off somewhere unexpectedly, as he sometimes did at the last moment, so I got into touch with my crew and told them to have everything ready for an immediate takeoff. When we had packed our things again and were ready to leave, I went upstairs to Hitler and the others. There had been no change in the atmosphere in the meantime, so I found myself an armchair in a corner and dozed. At 23 hours, Hitler called over to me. "Bauer, find out the weather situation in Munich." "Aha," I thought. "So we're going to Munich." And I rang up the weather bureau in Cologne. There were storms all the way, it appeared, but there was a likelihood that the weather would improve during the course of the night. Flying was inadvisable at the moment. I reported back to Hitler, who thanked me and said nothing more. Half an hour later, he asked me about the weather again. Once more, I rang up Cologne and reported back to him that the storms were dying down, as indicated. Twice after that, with about half an hour in between, I had to make further inquiries. The last report was no more rain, steadily improving weather, no further objection to flying. At 10 hours, Hitler asked me when was the earliest we could start, and I told him 2 o'clock, because although everything was ready, it would take us 20 minutes to get to the airfield, and some time to get the tarpaulins off the planes and release the guy ropes which held them down. And then, of course, the engines would have to warm up. In fact, we had to besteer ourselves to take off by 2 o'clock, but we managed it. The second plane was made ready for Goebbels, who was to fly with it back to Berlin the next morning. With Hitler were his 2 personal adjutants, 4 police officers, his servant and his chauffeur. We landed in Munich at 4 o'clock in the morning in perfect flying weather. Gauleiter Wagner was waiting there in a car to take Hitler into the town. When Hitler met Wagner, the 2 of them walked up and down together, deep in conversation for about 5 minutes. Hitler was obviously very excited about something. He kept flourishing the rawhide whip he always carried with him, and occasionally he slapped his top boot violently with it. When he finally got into the car with Wagner, He slammed the door, exclaiming, "I'll settle that swine's hash." The rest of us stood behind on the airfield with our mouths open. What on earth could have happened, and who was the swine Hitler meant? At that moment, the Munich air controller, Heiler, came running up. "What's happened, Bauer?" he demanded excitedly. "I've never seen Hitler in such a state, but where's your D-2600? How could I know Hitler was in this plane?" "What does it matter?" I asked. "Röhm rang me up yesterday evening," he explained, "and instructed me to let him know at once if Hitler landed, telling me he would hold me personally responsible for ringing up SA headquarters at once." I knew that Heiler had a very healthy respect for the powerful chief of staff, and now he didn't know what to do, whether to ring up or not. I told him that there was little point in it, because by this time Hitler must be there, and in the end, Heiler decided not to telephone. It was not until later that we learned just how important the whole affair really was. If we had flown in with my D-2600, Heiler would have known at once, or guessed, that Hitler was on board, and he would have telephoned Röhm immediately, and Röhm would then have had time to take whatever measures he thought fit. As it was, Röhm did not know of Hitler's arrival, and it was he who was taken by surprise. I went home from the airfield, and it was not until the afternoon that I learned from the wireless announcements what had actually happened. At about the same time, the telephone rang, and I was told that Hitler wanted to leave Munich at 16 hours. I had everything ready to take off at that time, and Hitler arrived punctually. When we reached Berlin, a big reception had been arranged for him. Goering had his air troops on the airfield waiting for us, and Dr. Goebbels was also there. During dinner, Hitler told me his version of what had happened. It appeared that he had been informed through the Italian ambassador in Paris that his chief of staff, Röhm, was preparing a putsch against him. Röhm was reported to have got in touch with the French and secured an undertaking that in the event of a change of government in Germany they would take no action. Röhm had already drawn up his cabinet list, and his chief aim was now to get his SA incorporated in the army and to secure the dismissal of the old Hohenzollern generals, whom he regarded as unreliable. Hitler acted at once on receipt of this information and nipped the putsch in the bud. On our arrival in Munich, Hitler had driven in Wagner's car straight to police headquarters, where the chief of police was the SA leader Schneidhuber. Hitler accused him point-blank of being in the conspiracy with Röhm, ripped off his rank insignia and his gold party badge, and put him under arrest. After that, Hitler drove out to Viesse, where Röhm was staying at the Hotel Hanselbauer. Röhm had set up guards, but most of them were drunk. Hitler arrived at 6 o'clock in the morning, just at the time for the changing of the guard, and the night sentries had gone into the guard room to wake up the men who were to relieve them. In consequence, Hitler marched into the hotel vestibule unchallenged and wrenched open the door of the guard room. The men were naturally flabbergasted when they saw Hitler before them. Brigadier Schreck then dealt with the guard, disarming and arresting them all. As Hitler went back into the vestibule, Standartenführer Uhl, who had just come down to see what all the noise was about, spotted him and tried to draw his pistol, but he was seized and disarmed at once by a detective named Högel, who was with Hitler. Hitler asked where Röhm was, but Uhl refused to reply. The proprietor was then called, and from him Hitler discovered which room Röhm was occupying. He went straight up to it and knocked on the door. Röhm's voice called out, "What is it?" "News from Munich," Hitler replied, whereupon Röhm called out again, "Come in then." Hitler wrenched the door open, and there, according to his account, lay Röhm naked on the bed with a young fellow, also naked. Hitler declared that he had never seen such a revolting sight in his life. He shouted at Röhm, "Get dressed at once, you are under arrest, and I don't need to tell you why." On recovering a little from his astonishment at Hitler's unexpected appearance, Röhm began to play the innocent and pretend that he hadn't the faintest idea what Hitler meant. But Hitler cut him short, and turning to the detective with him, he ordered curtly, "Högel, see to it that Röhm gets dressed, and then bring him downstairs." Hitler then went from room to room and hauled everyone out of bed except Röhm's doctor, whom he left in peace. All the arrested men were brought down and locked in the cellar until the arrival of transport to take them away. It was only then that Röhm's men realized how very few men Hitler had with him. 8 men had carried out the whole action against them. A bus arrived and the prisoners were bundled into it, guarded by 2 policemen with submachine guns, whilst Hitler drove ahead in his car. He knew that Röhm had already ordered his officers to meet him that morning, which meant that they were probably already on their way, so he personally stopped every car they met, offering his apologies to such people as were obviously not concerned in the affair and allowing them to drive on. But when a car came along with SA officers in it, and there were quite a number of them, he arrested them and put them into the bus with the rest of his prisoners. Only the drivers were left to take the cars back. They also met a lorry with 30 armed SA men. Hitler stopped this lorry too, and told the men they were to go back, as their orders had been cancelled. But the Obersturmführer in charge temporized. He had his orders, and he wanted to obey them. Whereupon Hitler's adjutant Brückner shouted at him, "You heard what the Führer said. Obey at once, or I'll shoot you out of hand." The man then got down at pistol point and was loaded in with the others, whilst his men were disarmed and ordered to drive back behind the bus under surveillance. The column moved along the Tegernsee road towards Munich, and as this passes Stadelheim prison, Hitler unloaded them all there. Röhm had had no intention of killing Hitler, of course. All he had wanted was to push him into the background. But the massacre which crushed the Putsch cost 72 men their lives. When Hitler had finished his story, he was still unaware that I had an important detail to contribute, namely, the misunderstanding caused by the fact that we had flown into Munich in a different plane, and not, as usual, in the D-2600. He listened with interest to what I had to say, and then remarked, "You see, Bauer, the hand of fate was at work there." I had already noticed that Hitler always saw the hand of fate in anything that turned out in his own favour. One night Hitler came back late to the Reichschancellery from a gala performance at the opera. It was 11:30. He came into the smoking room, in which, incidentally, no one was allowed to smoke, spotted me and informed me that he wanted to fly to Munich straight away. I immediately rang up the Weather Bureau and asked for the weather report. The whole route was quiet and cloudless, but there was a thick ground mist in Munich which would make landing dangerous. But when I passed this on to Hitler, he declared that it was impossible. It was a beautiful, starry night, which was quite true. That mist was just a Göring mist, he declared, meaning that Göring didn't like his flying at night and was always inventing reasons to prevent it. I told him that the report had come direct from the Weather Bureau in Munich. "I'll soon see about that," he said. He called group leader Schaub and ordered him to ring up the Café Heck and the Osteria restaurant in Munich and get the girls, who always waited on him, to the telephone. This was done, and then Hitler personally asked them to go out into the street and come back and tell him whether it was misty. Each of the girls did as she was told, and came back to say that there was a heavy mist on the streets. "All right, Bauer," he said. "You're right this time, but I know I have to be careful with you flyers. You're all under Göring's influence, and he wants to stop me flying at night." I didn't care to leave it at that, and I told him the simple principle I had always followed from my Lufthansa days. If the weather seems good enough, I fly. If it doesn't, I don't. A little later, Hitler gave me instructions to found a government flight, as he had told me even before he came to power that he would. I therefore ordered 6 Ju-52s, established a special hangar at Tempelhof Airfield, and began to look around in the Lufthansa for suitable pilots, mechanics and ground personnel to staff the new flight. I was to hold a government appointment, of course, but as yet there was no Luftwaffe, and they didn't quite know what to do with me. At first I was going to be under a higher civil servant, but Hitler didn't think this was quite the thing for an old wartime flyer. He decided I should be attached to the police, and so I was made a major of the Schutzpolizei. Formally I remained a policeman to the end, but actually I had nothing whatsoever to do with police matters, and I never attended to anything except my own affairs as captain of the government flight. We started with 6 Ju-52s, but towards the end we had 40 machines. During the war, I had sometimes as many as 13 four-engined Condors, a large number of Ju-52s, and many small planes such as the Siebel and the Fieseler Storch. These small planes were particularly useful because they needed less petrol, but nevertheless had a cruising speed of about 185 miles an hour and could carry 3 passengers. 3 Ju-52s were kept at Hitler's disposal, whilst Göring and Hess each had his special machine. Later, Goebbels, Himmler, Keitel and Raeder each had his own plane. I was responsible for the whole running of the flight, of course, and as I was often flying here and there with Hitler and so on, this meant a very great deal of work for me. For one thing, all our machines had to be very closely watched to prevent any kind of sabotage. Hitler's machines each had 2 guards, one from the SS and the other from the Gestapo. The other planes had only 1 guard, sometimes from the SS and sometimes from the Gestapo. When a machine landed after a flight, it was the flight mechanic's job to have it checked, overhauled and made ready to start again. Ground personnel were allowed to work on the planes only under his supervision or that of some other member of the crew. If for any reason this supervisor had to leave, even for a minute, perhaps to attend to a call of nature, work was suspended and the ground mechanics left the plane until he returned or someone else came to take his place. Whilst he was away, the guard, who was always present, took charge. When the work was done, the machine would be put away and no one was allowed to go near it. These precautions were introduced and very strictly maintained because our intelligence service had reported from Prague that attempts would be made to attach devices to our planes, governed by altimeters, so that they would explode at a certain height, causing the plane to crash and probably killing everyone in it. We didn't give our enemies much chance because in addition to these strict precautions, each machine always had a 10-minute trial flight before taking off, and any such device would have exploded by that time. At the end of April 1934, Hitler decided to go away for a week's holiday to Wiesbaden. We were to fly from Munich to Stuttgart, from where Hitler would go on by car. The whole affair was supposed to be a dead secret, but once again there was a leak, and when we got to Stuttgart, the streets were lined with people all wanting to cheer Hitler. They gathered in large numbers before his hotel, and they were told that he was going to take off from Böblingen airfield, where our machine was known to be standing. Hitler's car actually drove part of the way out to the airfield, but then turned off and made at speed for Wiesbaden. In the meantime, I had strict orders to stay on the airfield at Böblingen and not to land in Wiesbaden before 16 hours. I carried out these instructions to the letter, and then I waited for Hitler in the Hotel Koch. But he didn't arrive until 11 Darkans, and he was dead tired when he did. It appeared that along the whole route he had been held up by cheering people, and his car had often had to crawl. The thing had been made worse by the fact that the people hadn't been content just to see him pass, but had run after the car and in front, often for miles. Lice had had to be called out, not to clear the way for Hitler, but to prevent enthusiastic children from falling under the wheels of his car. Peasants even dragged carts across the road to stop Hitler's car so that they could have a good look at him. During his stay in Wiesbaden, Hitler regularly went for long walks in the park, which was closed to the public as soon as he entered it, though the people already there were not turned out, but merely warned not to interfere in the slightest way with Hitler by staring at him, crowding round him or following him. He also went for walks in the surrounding hills. In May 1935, I was instructed to fly Reich Minister Rudolf Hess to Stockholm. We took off in the early morning, made an intermediate landing in Malmö, and then flew on to the military airfield to Västerås near Stockholm. From there we flew on in poor weather conditions to Norrköping in the south, where Count von Rosen had his castle. It was a wonderful place by a big lake, surrounded by forests which were deliberately left untended in order to encourage the game, and which were said to be full of elks. Göring's first wife had been Countess Karin von Rosen. It was a strange world we came into. Every modern comfort and convenience was deliberately avoided, and Count von Rosen and his family lived exactly as their ancestors had lived for many generations. There was no electric light or central heating, and everyone ate and drank from pewter plate. The oddest thing, to my way of thinking, was that the only water closet in the place was in the servants' quarters. And every summer, it appeared, the Count and his family would withdraw without any servants at all to a sort of blockhouse in the heart of the forest, and there they would live for a fortnight calm. Pletli alone. In the evenings, the Count would sit with his wife and children in front of the great open fireplace in the hall and sing English songs, accompanying himself on the guitar. From there, we went to visit the famous Swedish explorer Sven Hedin, who was a lifelong friend of Germany. And then we returned to Berlin. Before Hitler actually came to power, the relationship between him and Reich. President von Hindenburg was not too good, although Hitler had a tremendous respect for the old field marshal, to whom he always referred as the old gentleman. It was only after Hitler came to power that the relationship between the two men improved, and then it quickly became warm and even friendly, particularly when the vigorous and determined younger man freed Germany from the scourge of unemployment. During these years, therefore, Hitler often flew to Marienburg and drove from there by car to Neudeck, where von Hindenburg had his estate. By this time there was only one point on which they still did not see altogether eye to eye, the Wehrmacht. Hindenburg was very apprehensive in this respect and feared that Hitler would take some radical step, which, in his heart, he knew he would find it impossible to prevent. Again and again he made his point of view clear to Hitler. Politics, that's your business. The army, that's mine. As a matter of fact, Hitler was careful to do nothing that would have displeased the old gentleman. He knew that time was on his side, and that he could afford to wait. And the radical step he did take in the year following the old president's death would certainly not have displeased Hindenburg. On 16th of March 1935, Hitler informed the German people that he had severed the last of the slave chains imposed on them by the Versailles Treaty and had reintroduced the old Wehrmacht. And the very next day he flew to Munich to take the salute at a great military parade. As we touched down, a salute of 21 guns was fired. Detachments of the Reichswehr, the police, the SA, the SS, the Labour Service and other uniformed bodies were drawn up waiting for inspection on the Oberwiesenfeld. Hitler was greeted by General Ritter von Epp, Reich Governor of Bavaria, on behalf of the Bavarian people. With von Epp were Old Field Marshal von Mackensen, Admiral Raeder, the head of the Navy, General von Blomberg, the leader of the Reichswehr, and Göring. Hitler was tremendously impressed by his reception and by his subsequent triumphal progress through wildly cheering crowds in the streets of Munich, and on the flight back to Berlin he could hardly talk about anything else. It was in the spring of this year that we were equipped with our first Condors, which had 2 cabins and could carry 18 passengers. They were the last word in design and construction, and they were capable of a cruising speed of 185 miles an hour. Amongst the many ultra-modern features they possessed was the new retractable undercarriage. On Hitler's plane, the first cabin was for him and the rear cabin for anyone who happened to be flying with him. In Hitler's cabin there were a table, an armchair, a small couch, and a safe for documents. There were pantry arrangements for the service of food and provision for a stewardess, our first. She was a certain Fräulein Diem of Augsburg, and she stayed with us until the beginning of the war. Hitler always preferred to be waited on by this stewardess, who was an attractive little thing rather than by his own manservant, and he made no secret of the fact. "I can never understand the Berliners," he would say. "They always want waiters to serve them. I think it's much more agreeable to be waited on by a pleasant and attractive girl." Our new machine, the Condor, took over our old number D2600 and was named Immelmann, like the other. It had a special visitor's book in which everyone who ever flew in it signed his name, and after a while it became a truly wonderful collection of autographs. Unfortunately, it was destroyed later on during an air raid on Schleißheim. Owing to the considerably increased speed of this powerful and comfortable machine, our flying times were quite materially reduced. For example, for the Munich-Berlin journey, we needed only an hour and 35 minutes. As Hitler was always greatly interested in flying times and always insisted that the landing should be as punctual as possible, special dials were built into his cabin from which he could see at a glance what he wanted to know, as well as a speedometer, an altimeter, and a clock. This clock was chronometrically adjusted before each flight, and I always had to tell him the approximate time on which I reckoned to touch down in the prevailing wind and weather conditions. My forecasts were something like 98% accurate. At first Hitler didn't much care for the Condor. He had grown attached to the old Ju-52, and an incident that occurred on a visit to Hamburg reinforced his opinion. He inspected several companies of SA men on the airfield at Fuhlsbüttel before leaving for Berlin, and then he came up to me to ask about the weather forecast for the return journey, as he usually did before we set off. As we stood there, a new Ju-190 came in and circled round once or twice before landing. I noticed at once that the pilot had forgotten to put down his undercarriage, with the result that he unwittingly made a pancake landing and slid and bumped along the ground clumsily for finally coming to a stop. No great damage was done, but the propeller was broken. The pilot and the passengers got out, very white in the gills. No doubt they had been badly shaken up. "You see, Bauer," exclaimed Hitler excitedly. "What did I tell you? That's the sort of thing that could happen to